situation, many countries still fail to act. The report says a failure of the governments to tackle inequality has forced people, especially the vulnerable population, to bear the brunt of the crisis and pay a much higher price than they should. Well, to help us look at how to improve equity in the COVID-19 era is Arielle Morino. She is the Vice President of Intel Cap. Arielle, many thanks for joining us here on Bottom Line Africa. This conversation comes at a time when COVID-19 has exacerbated inequality across the globe. But this report shows that majority of the world's countries are not doing enough to reduce inequality before the pandemic. What is the situation like after the pandemic?
Yeah, thanks so much, Michelle. I think what is very obvious is the pandemic has reversed years of progress across the world in healthcare, in education, in vulnerable populations, as you mentioned, and basically the COVID pandemic is globally threatening to push 71 million people back into extreme poverty, and that's a drastic setback for us to really achieve the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals.
Right, and we have countries, of course, like South Africa, one of the unequal countries in the world, COVID-19 further exacerbating the inequality levels there. We have countries like Swaziland, Nigeria, Namibia, where lockdown measures further widened the inequality gap. So what more then can governments do to reduce the inequality gap?
Yes, you're absolutely right, Michelle. I think there's a couple of things that governments can do to alleviate this sum. The first, especially as we're still in the COVID period right now, right? We haven't necessarily gotten out of that yet, is really further subsidizing the cost of healthcare. When we talk about vulnerable populations, these people are most at risk on a lot of levels. One is they're most likely to have pre-existing conditions, which makes them more vulnerable to contracting COVID and getting severely ill. They can't necessarily social distance because they're living in very cramped environments, so they don't have the luxury of social distancing, and they're more likely to be vulnerable employed. So, you know, they're day workers. If they're not working, they're not getting paid. So I think the first thing is really subsidizing the cost of healthcare. These people do not have the ability to pay out-of-pocket expenditures for healthcare, and many of them are still not likely on NHIF. I can't afford that 500 shillings a month to pay for that health insurance. So really increasing the cost of health coverage is one. Two is increasing the focus on data collection. So you mentioned the CRI report looks at what governments are currently doing, and they're looking at that at several levels. One is the policies that are effected. But second to that is how the policies are actually being implemented. And Kenya in particular has some really fantastic policies that might not actually be being implemented effectively. And in order to create effective policies, you really need to do that based on data. Now, the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics actually recently, just I think last month, released a gender-focused report, which is fantastic. This is collecting data that is intended to actually create policies based on informed information. Right. But there are opportunities for partnership here. Right? I mean, the government can work, of course, they can provide additional funding to the Statistics Bureau. They can engage with universities, they can engage with academic institutions and the private sector as well. But data is really key to developing these very informed policies.
Absolutely. And of course, we've had COVID seemingly hit harder on populations that already had been subjected to social and economic injustices. For example, when we speak about gender-based violence, it existed before COVID, but lockdown measures made the situation worse, increased the risk of gender-based violence and domestic violence, not just on women and girls, but really, you know, the entire population. We've had many countries fail to consider measures to combat gender-based violence, access to justice, access to safe houses, for example. What can be done to aid and assist governments to implement, if not adopt, these structures?
Yeah, and again, I think here specifically for gender-based violence, I do think that partnerships are key. There are a number of fantastic grassroots level organizations that are offering these things, but when the pandemic hit also, a lot of their funding dried up, they had to let staff go, they're also struggling with resources and staffing and lockdowns, as well. So they've really struggled to effectively carry out their programming as well. But there's a lot that governments can do in terms of gender equality overall. I think gender-based violence is a symptom of a much larger problem. And while overall women's rights has seemingly improved on a policy level, again, implementation is a challenge, but there's still very unequal pay when it comes to women and men. So implementing fair wage laws. Women carry the burden of unpaid care work. When schools are closed, again, now not only are they carrying the unpaid care burden that they normally would, but now they're teachers. Fortunately, schools have opened back up, but still, I mean, these are systemic issues that policy can address, and that gives good direction. There are several countries who increased maternity leave, Ethiopia, Zambia, and South Sudan, to name a few. Ethiopia also increased paternity leave. So again, it's really about gender equity to be reducing some of these things.
Right.
So policy does play a role, but I do think private sector engagement and partnership is also very key in this.
Right, and of course, again, when it comes to gender-based violence, we have issues of victims not reporting, the crimes due to either fear of not getting justice or being stigmatized in the same breath. And this happens not just in Kenya, but across the world, especially in Africa. How can governments strengthen social protection legislation, especially as a means of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals?
It's a really good question, and it's a big issue. And it's not just here, but even the best rape laws that are out there still require the victim to prove violence. She doesn't just have to prove that she didn't give consent. She actually has to prove violence, which is incredibly difficult. So there are some, legal aspects that really can come to play here. I also think, improving the police force could really go a long way. There are a lot of women police officers out there, and it's far easier for a woman to report to another woman. And so I do think that there's some level of engagement there. And again, probably the first point of call for these women will be these community-based organizations where there is confidentiality, where you don't have to, you can still have privacy, and those organizations also need to work very closely with the legal entities that can carry out their jobs effectively.
Let's talk about measures by governments to alleviate the impact and the effects of COVID-19, because we at the United Nations Population Fund there estimate that if not addressed, the COVID-19 pandemic has the potential of causing about 15 million more gender-based violence cases worldwide. And this is particularly felt mostly by survivors of gender-based violence who already are economically disempowered and perhaps economically dependent on the perpetrators of their gender-based violence. So again, in terms of alleviating the impacts and restoring the balance as should be, what can governments do? Again, I think that firstly, schools have opened. That's a good step in the right direction, so children are not stuck at home as they were before. I do think government can increase social protection policies overall, and that will have a good direct benefit on young women and girls. The livable wage for Kenya, which basically covers essential needs, is estimated to be just over 20,000 shillings a month. But the minimum wage here is about 13K. Right. Now, the Inua Jamii social protection program that is in place for those vulnerable individuals is 2,000 a month. So first of all, expanding that, because a lot of violence and a lot of stress has been coming, particularly in informal economies, due to unemployment stress, due to fears about the virus, due to being confined, in quarters at home. So if we can actually alleviate some of that economic pressure that the government can really establish, then you will see trickle-down effects that are reducing
gender-based violence and domestic violence generally. Most of this is stemming from economic pressure on the household parents.
Right.
So I think really improving social protection programs and expanding those more broadly to more vulnerable individuals would really go a very long way. They're currently very restricted in this country right now to a very small subset of population, and even what they're getting is very minimal in terms of what's needed. I mean, you're talking about a stipend that's 10% of the livable wage in this country, which will not, go very far.
A very pertinent conversation there, Arielle. Many thanks for your time. Arielle Morino is the Vice President of IntelCAF, speaking to us about measures governments can adopt to reduce in light of the 2020 commitment to reducing the inequality index in the world. And that's why we take a short break here on Bottom Line Africa. Do say there's still so much more news to come on the other side. Let's leave you now with Destination Africa.